Where do you think you're going, Christopher Columbus? By Jean Fritz, page 41. Columbus and his crew had been so busy entertaining natives that they'd had no sleep for 48 hours. So, of course, by the evening of the 24th, they were worn out. Columbus went to bed at 11 o'clock, and the others followed, all but the helmsman, who was steering, and the little ship's boy, who was turning the half-hour glass. But the helmsman was as sleepy as everyone else, and, rules or no rules, he handed over the tiller to the ship's boy. Nothing could happen on such a smooth sea, he assured the boy, and for 1 hour, nothing did happen. Then, smoothly and quietly, the ship went aground on a coral reef. The boy gave the alarm, and pell-mell the entire crew turned out. Above the uproar, Columbus shouted orders, and by San Fernando, they all stepped lively that night. Still, no matter what they did, they couldn't get the ship off the reef. When it began to leak and tilt on its side, Columbus knew it was the end of the Santa Maria. In order to save the property on board, he would need many men and many canoes. Columbus sent to the friendly king for help, and by sunrise, not only the king, but hundreds of his subjects were on hand. All day they worked without stopping for even a morsel of bread, Columbus reported, and when they had finished, there was nothing left on board and nothing lost, not even a nail. While the men worked, the king tried to comfort Columbus. He hung a plate of gold around Columbus's neck, but Columbus was so upset that he needed a lot of comforting. The king gave him more gold. In return, Columbus gave the king a shirt and a pair of gloves. Well, the king put on the gloves and was so pleased with himself that he gave Columbus a gold mask. They continued to comfort and appreciate each other until Columbus had collected a nice assortment of gold pieces, and the king had added a scarlet coat, a silver ring, and colored boots to his wardrobe. By this time, Columbus saw that the loss of the Santa Maria was no tragedy after all. It was a good thing, another of God's miracles. Columbus would go back to Spain, leaving some of his men on the island to gather gold. Then he would return with more and better ships to collect the gold that the men would have dug from the gold mine and the spices they would have gathered in Japan. In this way, his return was ensured. Marveling at how cleverly God was taking care of him, Columbus ordered a fort to be built for the 39 men he was leaving behind, and on January 4th, 1493, he set sail for Spain. For 2 weeks, the Niña, with Columbus aboard, and the Pinta wound among the islands, stopping here and there to take on parrots and give away bells. When at last they struck open sea, the men were delighted to see how well they sailed uphill, if that's what they were doing. But then they ran into bad weather. The ocean made up something terrible, Columbus wrote in his report, and the waves crossed each other. The Niña and the Pinta were separated, each afraid that the other had gone down. Never had Columbus been more in need of a miracle, and never had he prayed as hard. Everyone else prayed too. They would do anything they promised if the Lord would only save them. They'd walk barefoot to church. They'd strip down to their shirts. They'd light 5-pound candles. But what if they weren't saved? Columbus worried that no one would ever know that he'd found the Indies, so he wrote it all down on a piece of parchment. He wrapped the parchment in cloth, covered it with a cake of wax, put it in a barrel, and threw the barrel overboard. The barrel disappeared, but luckily it didn't matter. After 6 days, the Niña limped into a harbor of a Portuguese island. True to their promise, the men took off their shoes and socks and trousers and marched off to church. And what happened? They were arrested, not because of their dress. Men often dress this way to show that they were sorry for their sins, but because they were Spaniards. The Portuguese had no love for Spaniards. Columbus explained that he was admiral of the ocean sea and viceroy of the Indies, but the Portuguese were not impressed. Columbus said that he knew the king of Portugal personally. The king was far away, the Portuguese pointed out. Then Columbus stopped arguing. He wanted his men free, he shouted, and by San Fernando, they better be set free pronto. Grudgingly, the Portuguese gave in. The men returned to the ship, put on their trousers, shoes, and socks, and as soon as the water had calmed, they set off again. They had one more storm to ride out, and on March 15th, 7.5 months after they'd left home, they arrived back in Spain. At the last minute, the long-lost Pinta appeared and followed the Niña into port. The news spread quickly. Remember the fellow who was going to the Indies? Well, he'd found them, and now he was home. All across Spain, people poured out to see Columbus and his strange procession, making their way to the court at Barcelona. Columbus, richly dressed and ornamented, led the parade on horseback. He was followed by 6 natives, Indians they were now called, wearing aprons, gold nose plugs, beads, and bracelets. Then came men carrying treasures from the Indies, cages of parrots, baskets of curiosities, plants, shells, native darts, thread, and most important, samples of gold. Columbus's big day of triumph came when he reached court. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella didn't just sit still on their thrones the way they usually did when people called. No, indeed. The king and queen stood to greet their admiral. Then they invited him to sit beside them while he told his story. All the jokers who had laughed at Columbus in the past, all the doubters and the know-it-alls had to show him respect now, no matter how big he talked. For 6 weeks, Columbus remained at court, basking in glory. When the king went for a ride, he invited Columbus to come along and ride at his side. Before Columbus ate, a taster tasted the food from each of his dishes to make sure it wasn't poisoned, just as if he were a member of the royal family. He was given his own company of footmen to open doors for him and to serve him at table. The queen was full of compliments. Columbus had shown more wisdom, she said, than could ever be expected of a mortal being. And Columbus had to agree. What he'd done, he admitted, was a miracle. His whole life had been a series of miracles, and he had faith that the miracles would go on. After all, he had been chosen to do what he was doing. Perhaps because of this faith, he began signing his name in a secret code that took the form of a pyramid. No one has ever known what the letters mean except for the last line, which is a Greek and Latin form of Christopher, or Christ-bearing. It was clear, however, that this mysterious sign not only had a religious meaning for him, but also spelled success. He could not know that he was then at the peak of his success. Nothing would ever be as good for him again.